Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to try to get a handle on this situation in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
We've got this statement from Putin
Right.
that's been reported on by Reuters, and it basically outlines what he sees as the conditions for peace.
Yeah. Sounds like a good topic for a deep dive.
Yeah, so if you're ready to kind of unpack this whole thing and see what we can learn, let's jump in.
Sounds good.
So, it's interesting how Putin kind of uses these statements
Right.
to try to shape the narrative surrounding the conflict.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
It's a very strategic move.
Yeah.
He's coming out and saying that, look, the only way we're going to get peace here is if Ukraine agrees to be neutral.
Right. And he really emphasizes this point. It's not just about staying out of NATO or whatever.
Oh.
He's saying any move away from neutrality would turn Ukraine into a tool that could be used against Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, a crucial insight into how Russia views this whole situation.
Yeah.
To understand why this idea of neutrality is so important to them. We really need to kind of step back and look at history a little bit.
Okay.
Russia has seen itself as this major power in Europe for centuries.
Right.
With a sphere of influence that kind of extends across its western borders. Think back to the Cold War. They had this buffer zone of satellite states that gave them a sense of security.
Right. So essentially when Ukraine, which, has such deep ties to Russia historically and culturally, when they start leaning towards the West, towards NATO specifically, that really sets off alarm bells in Moscow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like if you're looking out your window and
Yeah.
you see someone you consider a potential adversary setting up camp right there on your property line.
Right on your doorstep.
That's kind of how Russia views NATO expansion, particularly when it comes to Ukraine.
Yeah. And then you add in this whole idea of a broken agreement. Putin's saying that Russia recognized Ukraine's independence after the Soviet Union collapsed, based on this unspoken understanding that Ukraine would remain neutral.
Right.
But now he's saying that the West, by even suggesting that Ukraine might join NATO one day, they've basically reneged on that deal.
It's like your neighbor, you agreed to their initial house plans.
Right.
But then they build this expansion that encroaches on your property line.
Yeah.
It feels like a violation of, that unspoken agreement you had about respecting each other's space.
Uh-huh.
So you can see how that's fueling Russia's security concerns.
Okay. So we've got all this historical baggage, this deep-seated mistrust.
Right.
And then Putin comes out and lays out these specific conditions back in June.
Yeah.
He wants Ukraine to completely abandon any thought of joining NATO.
Right.
And he wants them to withdraw their troops from the territories that Russia now claims as its own.
Uh-huh.
Essentially, he's asking Ukraine to cede control of these regions.
And that's a really tough pill to swallow for Ukraine. I mean, you have Zelensky who's talking about his victory plan.
Right.
He wants to reclaim all the lost territory, including Crimea, which Russia annexed back in 2014.
Yeah, so it seems like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place here.
Definitely.
On one hand, you've got Putin demanding what many would see as Ukraine's capitulation.
Right.
And on the other hand, you've got Zelensky aiming for a complete reversal of Russia's gains. Is there even any room for compromise here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then on top of all that, you have the whole issue of these disputed border regions.
Right.
Putin's argument is that the final borders should reflect the will of the people living there.
Yeah.
Specifically in those areas that Russia now claims.
But doesn't that feel a little circular?
It does.
It's like he's trying to legitimize the annexation of these territories based on those referendums that were held under Russian occupation.
Yeah, you're right. It's a very tricky situation.
Yeah.
And it raises some serious concerns about how genuine this offer of self-determination really is.
Yeah, what happens to the millions of Ukrainians who were displaced or who fled these regions during the conflict?
Exactly.
Do their voices not count?
It's a very valid question.
Huh.
It seems like Putin's playing a strategic game here.
Huh?
Using this language about self-determination and the will of the people to kind of advance his own agenda.
It's like he's saying one thing but doing another.
Right, and that's why it's so crucial to approach Putin's statements with a critical eye.
Okay.
Look beyond the rhetoric and consider the historical context, the power dynamics at play. What are the potential motivations behind his words?
So while Putin's pronouncements might give us a glimpse into Russia's perspective,
Sure.
they're really just one piece of a much larger and much more complex puzzle.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to solve one of those...
A Rubik's Cube.
Yeah, Rubik's Cube, where every time you twist one side, it affects all these other sides. We
Really?
can't just focus on what Putin's saying.
Yeah.
We got to look at the bigger picture. What's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine?
Absolutely. Because, while all this diplomatic back and forth is going on, there's a very real war being fought with, real consequences.
Exactly. And Ukraine, with all the support they've been getting from the West, they're still determined to kick out all the Russian forces from their territory.
Right.
But even with all that support, there are some serious questions about whether Zelensky can actually pull off his victory plan. I mean, some U.S. military leaders have even said that they're skeptical.
Yeah.
They're pointing out that it would take massive resources for Ukraine to achieve that goal.
It's kind of like this David and Goliath situation, where David, in this case, Ukraine has shown incredible resilience and fighting spirit.
Yeah.
But Goliath, Russia, with all its military might, still poses a formidable challenge.
So we've got these two seemingly irreconcilable positions.
Yeah.
Putin demanding all these concessions from Ukraine and Zelensky aiming for a complete victory.
Right.
Given that huge gap, what role can the international community even play in trying to bring about a peaceful resolution?
Well, I think the international community, especially key players like the U.S., the European Union, even China, they have a big interest in seeing this conflict come to an end.
Right.
They're influenced through diplomacy, economic leverage, potential peacekeeping efforts. All that could be crucial.
But hasn't the West's support for Ukraine, particularly the military aid, hasn't that actually prolonged the conflict by making a negotiated settlement less likely?
Well, that's certainly the argument you hear a lot from Moscow. They see this Western support as basically fueling the conflict.
Right.
Hardening Ukraine's resolve to fight, making negotiations more difficult.
So basically they're saying that the West is waging a proxy war against them.
That's the perspective they're pushing.
But then you have people who support Ukraine, and they argue that arming Ukraine is absolutely essential for their self-defense. And to create a more level playing field for any kind of negotiations.
Right.
They say that without that support, Ukraine would be forced to make unacceptable concessions under duress.
So you've got valid arguments on both sides.
Yeah.
And the key question is, can this support for Ukraine actually be used to get Russia to the negotiating table in good faith?
That's a really good question. And it's easy to get caught up in all the geopolitical maneuvering.
Right.
But we have to remember that behind all of that, there are real people whose lives are being torn apart by this conflict.
Absolutely. It's a tragedy, and it really underscores the human cost of this war.
Exactly. What does this conflict even mean for, the average Ukrainian citizen?
Oh, it's devastating.
Yeah.
I mean, their lives have been turned upside down. Homes, destroyed families, separated, living with the constant fear of violence.
It's a stark reminder that beyond all the political speeches and military strategies, there are individual stories of resilience, suffering, and loss.
And those voices deserve to be heard.
They really do. So as we try to wrap our heads around this incredibly complex situation, what should we be looking for in terms of potential signs of progress or, even escalation?
I think it's crucial to really closely monitor any shifts in the negotiating positions of both sides.
Okay.
Are there any subtle signals that they might be willing to compromise? Are they using back-channel communications to explore potential avenues for dialogue?
What about public opinion?
Right.
Both in Russia and Ukraine. Could pressure from their own citizens push their leaders towards a more conciliatory approach?
Well, public opinion can certainly play a big role, especially in democratic societies. But in a more controlled environment like Russia, it's tougher to gauge what people really think.
Right. It seems like there are just so many factors in play here.
There are.
Making the situation incredibly volatile and unpredictable.
Yeah.
And I think it's a reminder that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's a process.
It is.
A long and often difficult journey of dialogue, compromise, and ultimately reconciliation.
Exactly. And that process, however daunting it might seem, is the only way forward, the only path to a future where Ukrainians and Russians can coexist peacefully.
Okay, so let's circle back to Putin's statement for a moment.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that it's important to look beyond the rhetoric. And one thing that really jumped out at me was how much he emphasized Ukraine making sovereign decisions about its future.
Yeah.
Particularly regarding those disputed regions.
That's a key point.
On the surface, it sounds like he's taking this principled stance.
Right.
Respecting the self-determination of people. But it's way more nuanced than that.
It is, because when he talks about sovereign decisions, he's implicitly referring to those controversial referendums that were held in those regions under Russian occupation.
And, the international community pretty much condemned those referendums as illegitimate, saying they lacked proper oversight and were conducted under duress.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a classic example of using seemingly neutral language to mask a more assertive agenda.
So by framing these territories as making their own sovereign decisions to join Russia, he's trying to legitimize their annexation.
Exactly. It's like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too.
Right.
Presenting himself as this peacemaker while simultaneously solidifying Russia's control over those territories.
And this tactic of using language that appeals to these widely held values like sovereignty and self-determination to pursue a more self-serving agenda, it's a pretty common theme in geopolitics.
Oh yeah, you see it all the time. And it's something we need to be aware of.
It makes it even harder to separate genuine offers for peace from these calculated power plays.
It does. That's why critical thinking, informed by a deep understanding of the historical context and the power dynamics, is absolutely essential.
So for our listener, what's the key takeaway here?
I think the most important message is this. Don't be swayed by these simplistic narratives or pronouncements from any single source. No matter how authoritative they might seem, question assumptions, challenge easy answers, and seek out diverse perspectives to form your own informed understanding.
Because the quest for peace, it requires more than just good intentions. It demands a willingness to grapple with difficult truths and a commitment to the principles of justice and human dignity.
And that's a challenge we all share, whether we're policymakers, analysts, or just engaged citizens trying to make sense of this crazy world.
As we move towards the end of this deep dive, I hope our listener feels not only more informed about the situation, but also more empowered to engage with the complexities of this conflict in Ukraine.
You too.
It's a conflict that's going to continue to shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come.
Absolutely.
And understanding its nuances is so important.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of media literacy these days. You know what I mean? Oh, absolutely. With so much information out there and so much misinformation, it's more crucial than ever to, really develop those critical thinking skills.
So thinking back to Putin's statement and all this talk about sovereignty for those disputed regions, it kind of raises this question for our listeners. Is this genuine? Is this a real offer for peace? Like a way to de-escalate by letting these regions decide their own future? Or is it just a cynical way to legitimize what Russia's already done? Basically take these territories and make it seem like it was all above board.
That's the question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer.
No, but it's the kind of question we need to be asking.
Exactly.
It reminds me of that old saying, trust but verify. We can't just take Putin at his word. We have to look at his actions, his track record, and what's going on in the bigger geopolitical picture.
Absolutely.
To really understand what's going on.
And that's why it's so important to, get different perspectives. Read analyses from different experts. Consider viewpoints that maybe challenge your own assumptions.
It's all about getting the full picture. Exactly.
And we can't let all the noise, all the propaganda and misinformation drown out the voices of the people who are most affected by this conflict.
The people of Ukraine.
Their stories, their hopes, their fears should be what we keep in mind as we try to wrap our heads around this whole situation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Don't settle for easy answers. Don't accept what any leader says, even someone like Putin, without thinking critically about it. Dig deeper, explore different perspectives, and talk to people who have different views, even if you disagree with them.
Because that's how we learn and grow.
The path to peace, it's not easy.
No, it's not.
But it starts with understanding and empathy. And a willingness to, really engage with the complexities of a situation like this.
And who knows? Maybe by having these conversations, by asking tough questions, and by refusing to accept easy answers, maybe we can contribute in some small way to a better future.
To a more peaceful future.
Exactly.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. And as always, keep those brains buzzing and stay curious.